Hi, we return to Luke 16 today with Jesus' response to the Pharisees who overhear his comments about you cannot serve God and Mammon and lift their nose at him. So I'd like to start with a quote that I ended with last time and use as the cover for the last video from Doug Oakman from his article, The Radical Jesus, You Cannot Serve God and Mammon. And as I open his quote, I do want to note that Oakman is one of those scholars who wants to separate the radicality from Jesus from the moderate nature of Luke as he understands it. And although I don't see it that way, I don't see Luke that way, I think his work on Palestine at the time of Jesus and his understanding of the cultural context is excellent. And so what he has to say about Mammon is very important. So let's listen to his quote just briefly as we start. The linguistic evidence points to Mammon as signifying wealth collected in the bank or the storehouse or the treasury. Wealth which then becomes the object of trust for the powerful wealthy to the exclusion of God and neighbor. More importantly, Mammon is based in a system that exploits the many for the benefit of the few. To serve Mammon is to be alone in one's self-sufficiency. To serve God is to have concern for others and to practice reciprocity. Of course, what Oakman is pointing out there is exactly what we're seeing in this chapter. The wealth that allows one to be alone in one's self-sufficiency is what we'll see in the very next story that Jesus tells without a break about the rich man who has the poor man Lazarus at his gate and never sees him. And some of the other elements are what we've seen as well. When he refers to the bank, we're referring to the tables that Jesus overturns when he goes into Jerusalem, or the so-called pagan temples themselves, which operated as office buildings and banks. The storehouse we saw in chapter 12 with the rich man whose land produced abundantly, and he stored everything up in storehouses, and we see treasuries in other contexts, and Jesus talked about the treasure in heaven. So we've seen all the evidences of that, and the point being that Mammon isn't just money in particular, so it's a bad translation if we just see God and wealth as we see on the left side in the ORSV, or God and money as in some. Mammon refers specifically to wealth that's stored up. And as many scholars have noted, one of the differences in terms of the economics of what I call the religion of empire and the religion of creation is in the religion of empire, things are stored up, and in the religion of creation, they flow. Whether that's things like money or things like water or food or privilege or access or power, all those kinds of things. And of course in Luke Acts it's symbolized by the wind and the power of the Holy Spirit blowing and making things equal and providing access to everybody. So that's what Jesus is offering in rejecting the idea that you can't worship stored up wealth as well as the God who provides your daily bread and calls you to ask for it daily and expect it to flow, like the Israelites had to rely on the manna and not on what was stored up in Egypt. But the Pharisees, as we hear, find that ridiculous. And I can't underscore enough that this is especially a point where we need to recognize the Pharisees are not the historical Pharisees, but representatives of Luke's elite Roman audience. And my note below right there just notes that they were revealed to be eavesdroppers, and I've been noting that all along, that although Jesus was said to be speaking to the disciples in 16:1, we had no reason to think that the Pharisees and the scribes, along with the tax collectors and the sinners, were not still listening, but here we find that officially from him. And as Moxie notes, the reason for the Pharisees' rejection of Jesus, like an aside in an old play, it gives the audience insight into motives and character of figures in the play. So, as Vincent notes about this scene, he says, actual in-the-flesh Pharisees would have agreed that seeking God above all else was the best thing in life, and that love of possessions led one astray. Luke picks them to be the voice of caution. Their quote-unquote ridicule of Jesus is meant to expose him before the crowds as young, foolish, wrong-headed. It is the flip side of Jesus' exposure of the way their sense of pride showed up on how they behaved at banquets. The phrase for lovers of money, or philargoroi, is silver lovers, and it's only here and one other time in the New Testament, in 2 Timothy, and there we hear the love of money is the root of all evil, and that's a classic phrase. It's gone beyond the New Testament, certainly. And so we hear that, and the term for ridiculed here, exmukterizon, literally turned up the nose at him, and we see it only in one other time, and it's worth looking at there to see what are the two things that Jesus' opponents despise the most. One is his attitude toward stored up money, and the other is the attitude toward the cross. And we see the leaders scoffed at him using the same word, he saved others, let him save himself. And the soldiers also mocked him. So it's the idea that receiving suffering rather than inflicting it, and sharing money rather than storing it up, that are the most ridiculed and are at the very heart of the Roman Empire. Because the Roman Empire isn't based on money, it's based on what money can buy you, which isn't so much big things as we see in Western capitalist culture today, of the fancy watches and clothes and cars and airplanes, although certainly the Romans had fancy clothes, if not watches, cars, and airplanes. But what it bought you was honor, and honor got you power. And that's what it's ultimately about. So in the patronage client system, the emperor is at the top, but honoring the emperor, or emperors on top, because the emperor honors the gods, and the gods provide what the patronage support for the empire. So the whole system is grounded in money, but it's not the money in itself. And so the idea that one cannot serve that system and God at the same time seems completely absurd to them. And that's why we have to see what we hear here. So that leads us to the question of how the story is shaped and some of the issues that scholars have grappled with. So we've been looking at this throughout this whole section, and now we're here at the very heart of the matter. And that also works for people like Schallenberg and others who've seen this as a thematic chiasm, with the parable of the manager of injustice matching with the parable of the rich man and Lazarus down here, and then Jesus' two sets of comments on the parables framed in the middle by the Pharisees, lovers of money. So as we saw last time, these comments here in 8b to 13 are about the previous story, and what we're seeing here is really about the next story, as we'll see. A little piece of what we're going to see in 16 to 18 is parallel in Matthew, as we can see here, but not that much, and we can see they're in very different places. So two pieces of this are in the Sermon on the Mount, you can see in Matthew 5, but this part is way later, and of course these are all in order in Luke, and Matthew uses them in a very different context, and they're also very different in certain ways. So we're not going to do a lot of comparing of Matthew and Luke, we'll just look at the Matthew version of it. So let's put up our keywords here until we get to verse 16, and then we're going to look at that much more closely, because verse 16 is translated a number of ways, and it's not clear which one is the right one, so we need to make a close look at that. So what Jesus says here in verse 15, as my note has below, is illustrated by the example starting in verse 18, and that will lead through also into the next parable. So he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves in the sight of others." And we've already seen that once from the Pharisees back here. We saw it here with the lawyer, which is the Good Samaritan story, where the narrator told us, seeking to justify himself, the lawyer said, "Who is my neighbor?" But in 18:14, which is worth going to, we see almost the exact same situation here. Going back up a verse so we can see what's at stake here. Jesus says he told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, a Pharisee and a tax collector. And the Pharisee was standing there praying, "God, I thank you, I'm not like other people or even like this tax collector." And so that's what's at issue there. He's someone who's trying to justify himself in the parable. That's 2 chapters away from now. You'd think the Pharisees would have heard it by then. But he's saying it directly to them now. You are those who justify yourselves in the sight of others. And again, not about the Pharisees, but about the Romans, who try to make themselves look like they deserve and belong in the position they're in, which is to say positions of wealth and honor and power. But God knows your hearts, which we see in Acts a couple of times here, and cardias for hearts is 22 times in Luke, but I noticed the big gap in the narrative. We last saw it in 12:45, almost 4 chapters ago, and we next see it in 21:14, 4 chapters from now. So it's interestingly, this is a relatively isolated piece. God knows your hearts, and heart in the ancient world was your center of decision making, so not your emotional center the way we say it, but we could say heads or yourselves or your innermost being in that sense. Or your secret self. God knows who you are. For what is prized by human beings is an abomination in the sight of God. And we need to look at both those words. Prize really covers over the wonderful wordplay that Bednar's notes and her article on humor in Luke, and I was looking at that last time, as she says, what makes this dictum marvelous is the double meaning of the word hupsalos. It refers to what is highly regarded, i.e. wealth, and the holding up of something high, as in an idol, as in something we call raised up, or we lift it up, literally or figuratively. So what is lifted up by human beings is bedulugma, which is the strongest word in Greek that we know for something that's disgusting or an abomination. It's 123 times in the Septuagint, but only 6 times in the New Testament. But it's often used in the apocalyptic context of something of empire in a holy place. So whether that's the statue of Zeus that Daniel refers to, or in the New Testament a statue of Jupiter, perhaps in the temple put there by the Romans. It's also associated back in Isaiah with idolatry and lawbreaking. And notice the references here to Isaiah 113 and 66:3 basically frame the canonical book of Isaiah as we have it. And so it's surrounding the entire text around the question of what's an abomination to God. And then there's an interesting sequence in Deuteronomy, and I won't go through that all because it would take a lot of time to do it. But as several scholars have noted, there's a sequence in Deuteronomy 24 and 25 that follows what we're looking at here. So we can look at this one for a moment. It's to give you an example from Deuteronomy 25. We see here, this is about dishonest ways. And I was noting in the previous story in Luke 16, 1-8, that adikias for injustice should not be translated as dishonest. It doesn't have to do with telling the truth. It has to do with the justice of how things are distributed. But this does have to do with dishonest here. It has to do with cheating, having weights that aren't what they claim to be. But it also has remarriage after a frivolous divorce as part of that. And that will come up immediately in our story, because there are 2 ways to consider what follows here. It echoes what we see in Luke 3 about John the Baptist, which we'll look at, and it also illustrates examples from the Torah, from the Pentateuch, about what abominations are in the sight of God and what is being contrasted here. So, speaking to the Pharisees, that what you people prize, which is to say money and honor and power, is an abomination to God. And then, so how does this follow? That's one of the real questions that people have. How does this about law and the prophets and the law passing away and divorce follow? And those are some of the issues that scholars have had to grapple with here. We looked at this before, but now it's these two. How do these two questions fit into our situation? So this is where we have to begin to look at translations. And there are 2 questions around the translation of this verse. What is the temporal relationship being named between the law and the prophets and the kingdom of God, expressed by the Greek word mekri, which is translated here as until? And what is the tense of the Greek word biazo, which means to employ or to experience violence? And of course, that's exactly the question. Is it to employ violence, which is the active form, or to experience violence, which is the passive form? It's only in the New Testament twice, and both of those are passive. And yet the translations here are almost all active, and so we have to grapple with that. So let's look and see what's at issue. On the question of until, or mekri, the issue is Christian supersessionism. On some of the translations we see here, it's like the law and the prophets are being replaced by the gospel. And certainly Christianity has often seen it that way, especially since the Reformation. But that's not what Luke is saying, and I want to make clear that, and I'll show why in a minute. So there's translations here that say until, as if it's something has changed here since then. So until, but since then. And since is okay, that makes sense. But the question is, does this continue? In other words, are the law and the prophets continuing, and now this is on top of it, like an extra layer, or has this replaced this? And to answer that, all we have to do is look at what Jesus says in the very next story here to the rich man. They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them. Not they had Moses and the prophets, But they have and should listen. Not they should have listened like it was in the past. And he repeats it. If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced. So in the very active sense, you still have Moses and the prophets. And certainly he refers several times to the prophets being fulfilled, but especially on the road to Emmaus story 4 times. Once from the mouth of the people on the road to Emmaus, referring to Jesus as a prophet, but 3 times Jesus refers to either what the prophets have declared, Moses and the prophets, or Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, all as active. So plainly, this cannot be translated correctly as if the gospel is replacing the law and the prophets. It has to be expressed in a sense that it's an ongoing reality of that. And we see that in some places. For example, let's look here in Matthew 28:15, where we see it still told. This story is still told. So it was told and is still told. It wasn't told up until this day and stopped. It's still told. So in that same kind of way, the law and the prophets are in effect when John came, and since then the good news has been proclaimed. And what the good news is not a replacement of the law and the prophets, but plainly, as we've seen since Jesus proclaimed it, the coming and fulfillment of Jubilee. As Jesus said in chapter 4, this word is fulfilled in your hearing, the word of the good news being brought to the poor, released to captives, etc. So that's what's at issue, is the fulfillment of Jubilee, and it's the fulfillment of Jubilee that is in the face of the Pharisees as stand-ins for Luke's audience here, making fun of his whole economic idea of redistribution from the rich to the poor. So hopefully that makes sense of the first phrase of that. Now, the question of everyone tries to enter it by force. And some scholars argue about the everyone because how could it be everyone? But if we look at it the other direction around, we can see this. If we look at it from Luke 3 forward, we see all the alls, pas in Greek, 158 times in Luke, and plainly it's hyperbolic. Plainly, John did not go into all the region around the Jordan, and not all flesh would see the salvation of God, and not all were questioning in their hearts, and John didn't answer all of them, etc. So plainly Luke uses pas in a hyperbolic way, but the issue is what the last part of this phrase is, and there is no verb for entering it, so it just has to do with the question of biazo, by force. And I'd like to suggest that given the evidence, it has to be passive. It can't be people are forcing their way into it or trying hard to get into it, but there's a force compelling them. And I'd like to suggest it's the Holy Spirit. The power that's at issue is the wind that we hear, including in Acts 2. Because in Acts 2, we hear this, and suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And of course, you know the rest of the story, where they understand in their own languages, and then they all share everything in common with glad and generous hearts. So I'd like to suggest that the traditional translation, or everyone tries to enter it by force, or everyone presses into it, has it exactly backwards, is that people are being pushed into it because of the power of the Spirit. So we continue here. It is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter to be passed away. And this is what led me to add these red comments here on the parallels with Luke and Matthew, based on the comments from scholars that I'd read that saw this as a parallel. So let's look at it on this side and we can see what's going on. The law and the prophets were in effect until John. And that brings up chapter 3, when John came. And John answered, I baptize you with water, but one is more powerful than I am. I'm not worthy to untie the thong of his sandal. Then we get here to it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter and the law to be dropped, which brings up his rebuke of Herod for breaking the law. And of course, this also goes to the point that I was noting about the first part of the translation here, that if it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for a stroke of the letter to be dropped, then plainly the law and the prophets are still in effect. And then finally, that makes sense of the divorce passage, because what we're doing is recalling the situation with Herod, where he chastised Herod because of Herodias' wife. And again, if we look at it from this perspective, we can see the various echoes from chapter 3 in Luke into our situation here. All the references to chapter 16, both of what we saw and what we see now. So that's what holds these things together. They're all abominations that fit what we heard about John the Baptist and what he's said already. The question of easier for heaven and earth to pass away, teron, we heard a couple of times, one for which is easier to say, to tell the lame man to stand up or to forgive sins. And then we see it here, which is easier to say, for a camel to go through the eye of a needle or for the rich to enter the kingdom of God. And so in all three of these, the answer is that it's basically impossible for the other to happen, or at least people think it is, and none of them is it. But interestingly, on the issue of passing away, we see here that it says it will. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So interestingly, in the sequence of what's the hardest, it would be easier for the stroke of a letter to be dropped than for heaven and earth to pass away, and the hardest thing would be for Jesus' word to pass away. So it is suggesting at one level that the word of Jesus is more eternal than the word of the law, but only in the most extreme sense of things. And so then we get to the divorce issue, and again, it seems like it's completely taken out of context, but as my note here from Bruler notes, the issue of the connection with abomination here, with bedulagma, and we can also see it in relation, as I was saying, to John the Baptist. So if we hear it spoken that way here, we can hear, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another, I'm speaking to you, Herod, commits adultery. And whoever marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. And notice that it's different than the Matthew version, because the Matthew version has the woman responsible for adultery as well. And we don't have that here in the Luke part. So that's what sets us up. And hopefully what we see then is now all of this is setting up the story we're seeing for the rich man. And the rich man who has the great pile of mammon and is celebrating every day and has no idea what's about to happen. We'll see that next time. Bye-bye.